presentation, since I want to involve you guys in the process. So if you are online, you can just put in the www.menti.com address and put in the code for today. You can also do that if you're in the audience, or you can just use your picture of the barcode. So, and this is just to do some interactive polling about some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. So I'm just going to give you a second to get started there. Should be able to do that, or you can just go to the website and enter the code.
Oh, did it take the code right away? Because I didn't put in the code.
Yeah, you should be able to put in the code right away. Are people finding that it works? Yeah. And then we're just going to do a trial question to start. So my next slide. Have you ever used Mentimeter before? So we're just going to test to make sure the polling is working. Excellent. Oh, lots of people have used it before, so that's great. Mine's not opening.
Obsessed with the cat. Very good.
Just trying to up the engagement in the middle of the day when people are eating lunch. Tanya, are you okay? Okay, great. Well, I don't know if maybe so really this work actually originated with, again, my former student Kathleen, and we really started thinking about what role education can play in actually addressing climate change. And so to get started, I wanted to brainstorm a little bit with you guys about this question. So if you can sort of pop into the screen here, you should be getting a question. If you can just sort of brainstorm, what role do you see education playing in addressing climate change broadly? Active involvement, awareness, knowledge, lots of awareness, action. That's great. That's definitely, I want to say, like a more evolved view of the role of education. Changing behaviors, great. Pro-environmental behaviors, something I really care about a lot. Comprehension is fabulous. I think in the field, I know many of you guys are science educators and educators in the more focused on the US. If you look broadly at the field of international comparative education, you see the both environmental education and climate change education really in a bunch of different spaces. So people think about education, environmental awareness and environmental education, climate change and disasters as both sort of a source of inequality, who's being affected by climate, right? So climate vulnerability being a real new way to think about a new dimension of educational inequality. Also the role that climate change and environmental education can play in vulnerable contexts, like teaching students about the environment, also like what to do in the case of like a natural disaster. So for example, if you look at the many different types of disasters that can take place around the world, flooding is the one that causes the most frequent disruption to children's schooling. And so just even like teaching students about flooding and what to do in those types of situations. Certainly, there's also research that's thinking about the role education can play in just providing climate knowledge to people. But I would say the more recent work has really evolved to think about climate change, not only as knowledge, but like what do we need in the space of education to get people to act on this knowledge, right? So it's not only about what students know, but it's about their ability to both communicate what they know, if we think about advocacy and policy, right? And also for them to personally act and encourage other people to act on what they know. So I think we see a lot of different areas of research focus in this space. And I think you can just try to give a little bit of background there. If you look, and this varies cross-nationally, but I would say generally, you look more on average in the global educational space, we see a lot of this early work starting in the 70s, 80s, looking at environmental education. This happened in some parts of the US, but US is one of the places where environmental education and climate change education is not legally mandated in many states at all. There are other countries in the world, such as like Israel, for example, where environmental education has been an important part of their educational space reaching back to the 80s. Since that time, we've seen environmental education evolve to be thinking we called climate change education, which is, I will say, more sort of comprehensive. And then in the teaching space, I don't know if the people in science education are familiar with this here, but there's a whole line of work that's looking at what they call eco-pedagogy. And it really includes that sort of educational space where we're thinking about transformation and action and agency, and whether children or young adults see themselves as having agency in the climate change space. So it's really interesting. And from that space, we've seen sort of offshoots where we think about climate resiliency. How do we make schools and children climate resilient? Education for climate action, and then also climate communication and education is one of the big spaces in environmental education and climate change education. While some of these terms are more recent, and I take a push for it, given the situation on the planet is more intense than it has been previously, we can see if we look globally that the UN has been pushing both environmental education and also world conservation sustainability since the 1970s. And we've seen this actually sort of say ratchet up in the 2000s when we think about education for all, the Millennium Development Goals, and then most recently, the Sustainable Development Goals, where we're seeing not only sustainable development as a real push by the UN, but also education for sustainable development really being considered one of the foundations that's required for the UN to meet many of the sustainable development goals. If we think of, poverty alleviation or protecting the oceans or gender equality, the important role that education for sustainable development plays in actually achieving those targets. Now, sort of the big motivating question, sort of addressing the work that Katie and I have been doing is, what is environmental awareness, right? When we talk about this, how do we know if students have it or not? How do students actually learn to be environmentally aware? Does it just mean teaching more science? Why do students in some countries have higher levels of environmental awareness than in others? And what role might global citizenship play in students becoming more environmentally aware? And one of the reasons that we actually got to this space was actually looking at some of the countries where students have been actually doing a lot of environmental education. Israel is one that I mentioned. I've been doing some work there with colleagues at Tel Aviv University. And so even though students in Israel have been really learning about environmental awareness and water for peace in schools for a long period of time, if we look at high school students' levels of what we would call environmental literacy, which is a little different than environmental awareness, but environmental literacy, we see that the levels are actually pretty low. And so this was sort of a puzzle for me, like how do we explain a nation where environmental education has been one of their priorities, but when we look at the levels in high schools, that we actually see the levels to be relatively low. So we started looking at the literature about environmental awareness and found, of course, environmental awareness itself is only one dimension of what the UN would call education for sustainable development, but it is considered a foundation for children to learn pro-environmental attitudes, intentions, and behaviors. So from an education for sustainable development perspective, sort of the first step is actually building environmental awareness among students. From a clear definition, the Organization for Education and Cooperation and Development, which also manages the PISA, which is some of the data that we're using for this paper, defines environmental awareness as really being familiar with current environmental problems. Measures of environmental awareness, though, when we look at them, have really focused on what students know, right? So it's not about what they act or their action or their attitudes. And we see from previous research that environmental awareness is conditioned by many different things, including individual background factors and also school factors. So for example, we see that students that are from higher socioeconomic backgrounds tend to have higher levels of environmental awareness. Female students tend to have higher levels of environmental awareness and also less environmental optimism, right? Which is another piece there, sort of that tension between the more you know, like what happens about your outlook about the future, for example. Students that actually enjoy science and that also participate in more experiential science activities have been shown to have higher levels of environmental awareness, as have students who have engaged in more self-directed science activities at the school level. And then we also see that in wealthier countries, students on average tend to have higher levels of environmental awareness, right? So in the literature, we see a bunch of different things contributing to students' level of environmental awareness. But one of the, Katie and I, both being in the field of global and international education, really have decided to bring in this hypothesis that we have, that the way students actually see themselves as part of the world, as part of something bigger than themselves, may condition their likelihood of becoming more environmental aware. And so in our paper, we draw on both social identity theory, which is really a theory of like self-concept, with the idea that individuals feel different levels of identification with different social groups. And you can feel in-group and sort of out-group, and that this sort of social identity can be a really strong sense of feeling like you're part of the world, right? Identifying with something bigger than yourself. And so we draw on social identity theory and then align that with some work about global citizenship identification, where people sort of like putting a name on that type of identity, that people actually see themselves as part of the world, right? They have a psychological connection that is not only to their local community, not only to their nation, but also to the entire world, right? And in this way, we're arguing that global citizenship identification may create this normative environment that is necessary to develop the pro-social attitudes that would align with environmentally positive behavior, environmental attitudes, and environmental awareness. And so having this sort of hypothesis and questions, because I tend to be more of a quantitative researcher, and I'm also doing a couple of small projects in a green school in the Bahamas and a small school in Israel, we really wanted to look at what was happening more on a macro level. And so we turned to secondary data to answer these questions. And I'm going to talk to you about the data in a minute, but this is the way we've really cast this paper. So one, what does environmental awareness look like globally, right? To what extent do students demonstrate environmental awareness? And how does environmental awareness differ between countries and also between schools within countries? What are the important individual and school level factors that were associated with increased student environmental awareness? And then also the one that we were most interested in is growing up in a national context with a greater level of global citizenship identification associated with higher levels of environmental awareness on average. And so we turned to two different sets of secondary data. So one of them is the Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA. Is anyone here familiar with PISA, the PISA data set? So the PISA is a triennial survey of 15-year-old students that takes place in 72 participating countries. Well, it's more now. In 2015, it was 72 countries. It is representative of 15-year-old students in those countries. This has been happening every 3 years since the year 2000. One of the things that differentiates PISA, say, from the TIMSS, which is the third International Math and Science Survey, is that TIMSS is a curriculum content-based assessment. PISA is actually measures students' ability to use and apply the knowledge that they have in English, math, and science. And the reason that we're using 2015 PISA data instead of 2018 is because in 2015, the PISA focused on science. And so in addition to there being an environmental awareness and environmental optimism indices in the PISA, there are also several variables that talk about students' science experiences outside of the classroom, whether they were doing inquiry-based science, the science resources that their schools have. And so even though the data is a little bit dated, we decided we would use this. And so we matched this data to the World Values Survey, which is a comparative social survey that's been taking place since the early 1980s. This study happens, it's also aligned with the European Values Survey, and it really explores social, political, religious, cultural values in countries around the world. We used the Wave 6 data, which was gathered in 2010 to 2014. Because there's so many countries, they gather their waves in 5-year data, 5-year periods. And in the Wave 6 data, they surveyed 60 countries. And so we basically matched the World Value Survey with PISA, or if we had data about global citizenship identification from the country, and if we had environmental awareness data, and not all countries provided all of the data, but that left us with 27 countries where we had data from both sets. And so that's the 27 countries that we're working with here in our analysis. That left us with over 100,000, so 135,000 roughly 15-year-olds that were attending about 6,500 schools in 27 countries. And so that's the analytic sample for the paper. This is just, I don't want to spend lots of time looking at this, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the analysis and our sort of findings. And so just letting you know sort of some of the data that we looked at. So at the individual level, we obviously are interested in our outcome, environmental awareness. We also looked at students' gender. We looked at the economic, social, and cultural resources that a family has as a proxy for SES. This little ones that have the little plus by them are indice variables, where they were generated by combining the answers to several variables and then actually standardizing it using item response theory around a mean of 0. We have science literacy, which is their score, their science score on the PISA. Students' own self-reports of whether they enjoy science, their own reports of how motivated they are to learn science, and whether they experienced inquiry-based science instruction. We also looked at school resources. So we looked at school science resources, the location of whether the school was in an urban, rural, or suburban area, and then we looked at average science literacy in the school and average SES in the school. And then finally, at the country level, we looked at global citizenship identification. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that measure in a minute. We also looked at countries' environmental protection indices and also the GDP per capita to get a measure of how wealthy the country was. And so I want to talk about these two, environmental awareness and global citizenship identification, in a little more detail so you understand what we're working with here. So the environmental awareness variable from the PISA, again, used item response scaling methods to create an indices variable of environmental awareness. Students basically answered these 7 questions. How informed are you about the following environmental issues? When Katie and I started working on this paper, we actually used this continuous version, an indexed version of environmental awareness. We also estimated several models using multi-level logistic regression, where we just dichotomized these awareness of these different issues and tested the models that way as well. But for our bigger story, we're focusing on the overall level of environmental awareness here. So for example, students asked or answered this question. So you guys want to go ahead and try to answer it? So how informed are you about the consequences of clearing forests for other land use? Students could answer, I've never heard of this issue. I've heard about this, but would not be able to explain what it is really about. You could answer, I know something about this and could explain the general issue, or I am familiar with this and would be able to explain it well. We're pretty environmentally aware in our audience here. It's nice. Nobody's over here on I've never heard of this, which I'm going to consider a good sign, given that you're all many of you are science educators. So basically, they answered a battery of questions for different types of environmental issues, and these answers were averaged to come up with an environmental awareness ranking for them. For global citizenship identification, we actually created a country level average from all of the individuals in the country that they answered this question individually. The World Value Survey is an adult survey, so it's people over the age of 18. So we're really trying to capture just the general global citizenship environment in the country. And we can talk about whether that works or not after you see our results. But basically, citizens were able to, they answered actually a battery of questions about how well they identified, like as a national, like with our nation, with their community, with their culture, but they answered this question, I see myself as a world citizen. And they can actually answer strongly agree, strongly disagree, agree, or disagree. And we are arguing that this measure reflects a normative environment of global community membership, and following Pilcher, who used this measure from the World Value Survey related to other topics in his work. So if you had to guess, and again, we're looking at this period between, you guys don't know all of the countries, but I'm giving you a couple of choices here. If you had to guess which country had the highest level of global citizenship identification, again, during this period, what would you guess? We've got South Korea, Qatar, the US, Chile, and Sweden. So again, this is the country with the highest percentage of people actually say that they identify as a citizen of the world. Interesting. I'll let a few more come in. I think this is set up to identify the right answer for you guys, but if not, I'll tell you here. Oh, it doesn't tell you. It's actually Qatar. Comes back, and if you look at our next slide, here we go. We've got Qatar, and it's not even close. They're way up here for Qatar. We can see that the US is about over here, which I think probably is not surprising for people. I think this is actually interesting. We have some countries, for example, in East Asia, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea on the lower lens of global citizenship identification. We also have Turkey and Thailand, Mexico up here on higher levels. Yes.
Can I just ask something about that? That's a self-report.
Yes.
They believe that.
Yes.
They are.
So what we did for the measure, it's the percentage of, it's a representative sample in each country of adults over 18. So if they reported, I see myself as a citizen of the world. So it doesn't have anything to do with what actually might be happening or their geopolitical policies or even policies within the country. It's self-reported. Yes, absolutely. Of whether I see myself as a citizen of the world. So we can see here that roughly 20% of Americans answered that they would see themselves as citizens of the world. And the way that we did this, again, also, if you look at we did this as strongly agree. So we really were trying to identify people that saw themselves as world citizens. So if they just said, yeah, agree, we didn't include it as a positive percent indicator. Okay, so our analytic strategy. So we did use multiple imputation methods for cases where there was missing data. We used multi-level regression analysis in the version that I'm showing you right now, and multi-level logistic regression analysis when the outcome was dichotomous. We started with a null model to look for differences between countries and schools. And then we basically estimated a series of nested multi-level models, really just to take into account the different clustering at different levels of the data, to look at whether global citizenship identification at the country level conditioned environmental awareness. And we really looked at the proportion of variance that it might explain at the country level and the school level, even though we were able to look at the individual effects. And I'll show you what was significant from the individual factors. We were just interested in the variance at the school and community level. So to what extent do students demonstrate environmental awareness? How does it differ between countries and also between schools within countries? So I think this is my last question for you guys. What country do you think had the highest level of environmental awareness in 2015? I've got Turkey, Singapore, US, Brazil, and Japan. There are her choices. Singapore, Turkey, Brazil, Japan. No one thinks the US. Like many international assessments, the US tends to come in the middle on most of them. So if we look, the answer is actually Turkey, right? And Singapore is up there, second one. So people that answered Singapore, also a very good job for Singapore. And this is an interesting, I think, if you look just descriptively, you think of the global citizenship figure that I showed that was similar. Clearly, the countries are in different places. We're not seeing any type of perfect alignment, but I can say that some countries, for example, like Turkey was the second highest country with global citizenship certification. We also can see Japan here at the low levels for environmental awareness, which also honestly is striking because in I want to say the past decade, Japan has done a lot of work both in global citizenship education and in education for sustainable development, like in their curriculum. So also very interesting here. So you can see that there is actually quite a lot of variation in students' levels of environmental awareness cross-nationally. Again, we want to remember this is just environmental awareness. It's just a composite answer to what do we know about water pollution? What do we know about air pollution? What do we know about land use? And then we can also see, but we can see that there is quite a lot of variation, around the mean. We also can see, this is just a snapshot from the paper, where if we look at different countries, that we also see a lot of variation within each country when we look at students, right? So students are experiencing probably different things in different parts of their lives. And even in countries that have relatively high levels of environmental awareness, we're going to see a great deal of variation at the school and also student level. So I'm going to not focus on this, but I just wanted to show this is also from our paper where we estimate these are the big sort of 5 big models where we have a null model. We look at one with individual factors, one with individual and school factors, and then we look at some of the different country indicators. The bottom of the table, this is actually showing the measures of variation where we're looking at variance that can be explained at both the country level and the school level. So I'm just going to sort of get to the findings, and then maybe hopefully we can have a discussion about what you guys think about the whole issue in general. So this is just trying to show you the results from the individual level of the model. So this was the second model where we're controlling for school country level characteristics in this model, but just really showing you all of these are statistically significant, right? So here we see that male students controlling for everything else in the model. Male students have a little bit more higher levels of environmental awareness on average. We saw a positive effect of student families' SES a little bit. What they know in science, statistically significant, but we're not seeing this, powerful effect of like their science score, so what they know on the science test. But we see that enjoyment of science, whether students actually like participating in science, and also inquiry-based science experiences being the most influential. If we look at these different sort of indices, these are all on the same scale measured, and then this one here is science motivation. So all of these things were actually statistically significant in the individual level as far as student background and influencing their environmental awareness, controlling for school and country. Surprisingly, school level characteristics didn't actually play much of a role. If we look at the school level in our analysis, you can see here that the school science, so the average science literacy of the school mattered. So how well the students were doing overall, sort of the climate of science, but not science resources or the SES of the school. So when we think about what factors were important at the individual and school level, which was one of our research questions, we found that many of the individual level factors from previous research were significant predictors of environmental awareness, that male students and students with higher SES had higher levels of environmental awareness on average, and that also these factors that related to science matter, right? Students with higher science literacy, although not as impactful as some of the other measures, mattered, but inquiry-based science instruction and also students who enjoy science more had a high impact. And at the school level, children who go to schools with higher science performance on average mattered, but that was really the only effect that we saw from school level variables. So then if we move to the global piece, I'm going to focus in on these measures below here. So this is really showing you the variation at this country and school level in the different models. So this is a model that doesn't have any other variables in it. It's our null model where we just partitioned the variance that we could attribute to country and to school. Nothing else is in the model. In this model, about 3.6% of the variation in environmental awareness can be attributed to differences across countries, and about 11% could be attributed to differences between schools in those countries. When we added the individual level factors to the models, we actually saw that the variance at the country level went up a little bit to about 4.5%. And we saw the variation at the school level that could be explained by school differences within countries went down a little bit when we controlled for all those individual background characteristics that mattered. And then finally, in our final model, where we included a global citizenship identification and then also the country's GDP, we found that when we included that in the model, that the variation that could be attributed to country level characteristics that were not ones that we had in the model went back down to about 3.5%. In school went down a little lower to 6.7%, I think, in that space. So this is, I think, really telling us that while global citizenship identification one, that there are country differences, right? So that some of the variances in environmental awareness, that variation can be explained by differences at the country level. Our global citizenship identification variable explains very little of that. Like I would say like a little less than 1% when we think about it. So it doesn't seem like a really powerful predictor, although it may matter to some degree. So I'd say like when we look at our sort of research questions, that we basically found that global citizenship identification at the country level does matter. It was a statistically significant predictor of environmental awareness. We found that it just explains a very small percent of the variation though when we look across countries, and also that GDP, so the gross domestic product or how wealthy the nation is, also positively affects environmental awareness in each of these countries. I'm close on time, so I'm just here. So I guess our key finding, I'd say, from this exploration is that many of the individual level factors related to science instruction and science literacy, personal enjoyment and motivation for science are significant predictors of environmental awareness, that we do see differences between countries, even when we take into account the impact of student and school characteristics, and that global citizenship identification measured at the country level conditions environmental awareness, although it only explains a very small proportion of that variance. And then I would say that thinking about moving this kind of work forward, right? So one of the limitations would be that we're really only looked at this environmental awareness variable. It was really all we had thinking about doing this kind of work cross-nationally, right? So one thing to think about is like, what would we want to measure? Would we want to look at environmental knowledge as well? Would we want to think about pro-social environmental behaviors? When we think about wanting to learn more about this topic at a cross-national level, what would that measure actually look like, right? What do we want to know? And then I think another piece here is for us, because the World Value Survey only measured individual level global citizenship at for people that are over 18 years old, we ended up creating a national measure of global citizenship identification. On a personal level, one of the things I'm doing in these little projects that I'm working on is thinking about how students own answer to that question. So if like Tanya sees herself as a global citizen, how does that actually affect her? Not only the sort of wider climate, and also thinking about other ways. So I think you said Mary, right? That Mary mentioned, like, is this just self-reported, averaged up to the country level? Is there other country data that we could look at that would help us get a better sense of the country context that students are growing up with and how that might affect their environmental awareness and attitudes? Yes. So this is just thinking with this a little bit more. And I'd say like my final plug before I open up for questions and discussions in generally is that I would really like to see us really reconceptualize our understanding of environmental awareness or climate change awareness is to be not only that aware or knowing, right, but students developing their own sense of agency in relationship to a global environment so that we know that they have both the knowledge, but also the agency and attitudes to actually act and like change the world around them. And part of that is them believing that they actually can do that. So thank you. And I'm happy to take questions and to just sort of talk more generally about this topic. Thank you. I'm gonna stop the screen sharing.
Yes.
So that we can pull people's faces up if
Yeah,
they're.
that would be great. And I've just received, so thank you so much for your talk. I'm really looking forward to a lively discussion. And I've just realized that we might not be able to hear the online audience in case they want to speak. So can we just test it? Amy, can we hear you?
Amy's still muted. So
Amy's muted. Okay, so she sent me a message saying we might not be able to hear the online folks. I just want to make sure if they want to speak that we can. So maybe we
Yeah.
can be aware of that. So
Okay,
yeah,
and also I'm happy to read out questions.
Yeah.
You can keep the chat there.
people do that too. So we want to balance questions from both the in-person audience and also the online. And we just basically invite people to jump in. And if you are online, you can unmute yourself, or you can raise your hand, or you can type your question in the chat and we can read it for you. I actually have a question. If you don't mind.
Yeah, good, Danielle. Yeah, thanks.
I'm always curious how researchers arrive at the area of research that they do. So I'm curious how this topic connects with your own personal interests or your own experience, or like what motivates you doing this work?
No, that's a great question. And I actually, the way that I know Tanya Sargent here is we've been working in rural China together for a really long time. And I would say that most of my career in international and comparative education has really focused on educational inequality in terms of access and quality in China, rural education, issues that are unique to rural areas, and then I would also education in the context of migration. And so I'd say that I sort of arrived at this interest in two ways. And one is that in like my wider interest in migration, not just in China, but in other parts of the world, I think we're seeing more and more people that are migrating as a result of change, right? So that was like, sort of like my first entry point into that space. And then as I learned more about that, and started looking at what was happening in this space, I feel like I started noticing just so much difference, right? Which I feel like that the comparative lens is really useful there. When we think about international comparative education, we often think about not only what can I learn about what happening in other countries, but how does understanding what's happening in other countries help us think more in different ways about what's happening in our own country, right? So, and at the same time, actually, well, around the same time, I have a daughter who's a senior in high school right now, and she actually participated in a lottery type event in our local public school, where she could do all of her 7th grade curriculum at the local watershed. And so she had to be pulled out to continue in like her tracking for math, and then also for her foreign language. But the rest of the day, the English curriculum, the social studies, all of the curriculum was basically generated around the local watershed. But there were only 40 spots, like it was a lottery piece. And so she had transformative experience doing that, but it also just made me think about inequality and access to this type of education in the United States and also other countries. And so sort of just thinking more about that puzzle. And then, as I said, as I learned more about it in countries where they've had a history of doing this, then I became sort of puzzled about like, well, why, if they are learning about environmental science, are people not more aware and action oriented? And started thinking about other factors that certainly the political discourse in the US contributed to that as well. Actually, one of the more recent wave of the World Value Survey number 7, actually has several questions in it about people's beliefs about science, which is interesting. So I feel like science has been caught up in a geopolitical discourse in the US, but in some other countries actually as well. So that's how I got into space. Yeah.
Given the interest in like students actually applying knowledge about environmental awareness and various measures, have you considered looking at data around either civic education in various countries or youth civic engagement?
I think that is a great idea. I think it aligns a little bit like with the global citizenship interest that I have. And so, for example, we have like 4 pilot schools in Israel right now that we're looking, but really we've been looking at more like coding textbooks and looking at lessons related to global citizenship education. I think doing more broadly to think about civics and the way people think about science knowledge potentially could be useful. In the Israel case, we're trying to figure out whether there's whether strong national identity potentially could be like in conflict with having a strong global citizenship identity in the way that you think about the environment, but which is sort of like preliminary. I also have some like I teach a course actually in the spring that's called Educating for Global Citizenship and Sustainability that looks a little bit at the crossover of these topics. And the students in the course are mostly master students, but last year they had to come up with a global action plan that was like they could implement. And one of them actually works for Educational Testing Service. I guess that's not that far from here, but she was actually, she planned this project that I believe she's like implemented, that she was having students do like knowledge exchange between a school district in the South in the US where there was less sort of climate focus on what they were doing. And I think one here in New Jersey, and like part of what she was looking at was like how students actually could talk to each other about these topics in a space that was sort of separate from, I think, civics and citizenship and other pieces. But I think that's a great idea.
Did you have anything first? I thought you did.
Oh,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
I kind of had a question, but I think
Yeah.
you kind of answered it when I was thinking about, like any information you all have about why countries like Japan and, South Korea are so low on it, but I think it may have to do with this national identity thing, right?
Possibly.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that the Japan case is very interesting. I think that I'd love to see someone study that. I don't think it's me. I've spent a lot of my life working on my Chinese, and I'm not ready to venture into tech. But it would really take someone that would really understand the culture, right? And the attitudes about citizenship in other countries. So possibly, but I think it is a puzzle a little bit. Yes.
So now, like in 2023, now with like the surge of like information that we have at our fingertips, there's also like misinformation that's also very rampant. So instead of just like awareness on climate change or like environmental things, do you have any insights on what students would know about climate change and the environment there?
Not from this work, I don't. I think that so for me as someone, and again, I did this with Tanya, we've collected waves of survey data in China and spent a lot of time collecting those measures and like thinking with the questions. So as someone who does that kind of work, I feel slightly frustrated about the sort of inadequate data we have on these topics, right? So I'd like to know not only like what students like think they know, what they actually know, and then also what they do with what they know. And that's really my motivation with some of these smaller projects that I have right now, is trying to get into this space that's relatively new for me, to try to come up with some questions and measures that I think actually would be more helpful in thinking about this topic. But I think the question that you're asking about misinformation, right? And like students might think that they know something, right? Links to the question, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. Awen asked about civics, right? For example, at the School of Education at Stanford, they have a big history education group, but one of the big things that group is actually doing now is about information literacy and misinformation related mostly to politics and history, right? But you can see that many of the skills that they're trying to develop with those students that maybe we initially wouldn't expect that we would need them in science, but we probably do. We think about not only environment, if we think about like pandemics and health and so many things, right? So I think if I were a PhD student, that I would see the alignment of those two spaces is an important one.
So I was going to ask something, you touched on it a little earlier about sort of issues of equity and environmental justice too. And I was thinking about, you know, you were looking at the connection with people who think they're a world citizen, but I'm working right now with this, and this is not my area of expertise at all, but I'm working with a doctoral student and she's looking at environmental justice and how it is and isn't being taught in social work education. Christine Morales, or you know her. And so her work's really interesting. But you know, what I've learned and what I think many of us know is that, you know, environmental injustice is mostly experienced by communities of color in the United States and under-resourced communities perhaps, and around the world.
Around the world.
So when you started talking and you said women maybe are more sensitive to it, and I was thinking people who live it and experience it would be very sensitive to it, aware of it, and I just wanted to hear you speak about that because I don't really know much about it, but I was curious about the move to look at being a world citizen and that versus living in a community and experiencing it and what I know about it, wanting to take actions too.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking about, I had that exact same question, and I was wondering why Brazil was so far to the
Right.
left.
Right.
Because I'm thinking of like deforestation and things
That's
like that in
right.
Brazil.
Exactly.
You would think people experience it more. So.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, I can't empirically answer your question, but I can speculate a little bit. So I do have this relatively small project that we're working on at one main school in the Bahamas. I mean, that project is very much about the climate action and communication, but then I also am involved in, I was just recently in Indonesia on a Fulbright, and the work that I've been doing in Indonesia is related to not climate change education, although in higher education, environmental and climate change education is part of like what they're trying to do in all different types of higher ed, whether you're being like a physicist or you're going to go work for the government or you're going to be a teacher, which I think is really interesting. But in Indonesia, I'm looking at climate vulnerability. So students who basically are experiencing environmental disasters and what that looks like as far as its effect on their attendance and then learning, and also looking at it in the short term and also in the long term. And so I can tell you a little bit about both of those things. So both Indonesia and Bahamas are places that are climate vulnerable, right? Indonesia lies on the Ring of Fire. While I was there for roughly 3 weeks, I experienced an earthquake. My flight got detoured because of cloud ash from a volcano eruption, and there was a landslide when I was there. And I was there like literally like in 3 weeks, right? So what we're finding in that work is that often these big global headline attention getting events that students, a lot of aid comes to the area, the government is pressured to aid the areas, right? And the impact of sort of climate natural disasters in those cases is relatively short term compared to smaller resource constrained remote communities that maybe like flood repeatedly, right? So they flood and then the kids go back to school, the kids learn to deal with the flood, they flood again. So we're looking really at the impact of that. And I would say that I don't want to say that people don't think climate is a problem. They're like living with climate, right? Disasters frequently in their lives, but I want to say in some ways people are adapting to that being like their way of life, and it may not seem as dramatic as when schools are disrupted in places where people are not experienced with actually that happening so frequently. So I don't know if that affects like attitudes. Like you would think that it would spur action, but I wonder whether there's just, given all the different things that are happening in some of these communities, that it's a part of the way schools have learned to function. And then in the Bahamas, also a very vulnerable area of the world in terms of like, typhoons and storms and hurricanes. Also, both of these places are vulnerable because of the developing world, right? Because they're really suffering the consequences of climate inaction in the developing world. But I would say that, again, relatively little, Bahamas is not my wheelhouse, but there's very little action as far as thinking about like the public school, as far as like what can we do to teach students about the environment? How can we like advocate? How can we advocate on the global stage? How can we talk about the way we're being affected by decisions that are happening other places? That it really is the environmental education that we're seeing in the Bahamas is happening in small pockets that are either in private schools or being done by nonprofit organizations that are trying to like educate people. But my experience has been that that's a pretty uphill battle. And then I also think actually in some of these countries, well, in the Bahamas, again, I'm collaborating with a student of mine and then also a professor at one of the universities. And there's also like an identity that's associated with what a climate activist looks like. And in many places, like people consider them like often like white young women that want to go change the world, right? And so part of it is about in school, children learning to see themselves as climate activists and feeling that they have the power and the agency to be effective in that space, I think, and change the world. So.
Wonderful. I loved your presentation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to say that I have to
So I just wanted to say I really enjoyed your presentation and so many things, so cutting edge and so many of the things that we're super interested in.
Well, thank you for coming because you're so busy. So it's so
I have to go to the same meeting.
There's a question in the chat. Great. Do you think students' perception of their own country and perhaps their ideas of patriotism may shape how they identify as global citizens? I do think so. I think possibly, right? I think in some places there certainly is this tension between, and I think that's a whole area of research. I mean, global citizenship education is a whole space in of its own, but I think that in some contexts that there is a belief that you can't be a loyal, American if your allegiance is with like the UN, right? Or the context that you're allied to is actually bigger than what's the best for your country. I mean, I think that's a false dichotomy personally, but I do think that people's view about their own country can shape their view about citizenship more broadly.
I'm also curious how, and your research might not touch on this, I'm just kind of thinking out loud. I'm curious about environmental awareness, what it means to the participant. And on one of the slides, it showed that enjoyment in science tends to yield more environmental awareness. Whether participants are viewing environmental awareness as like a hobby, like something that you do in your free time, or whether it's an actual necessity for the earth. And how, I'm just curious how students or children who are living with this constantly, if it becomes normalized to them or if it becomes a source of stress versus people who participate in science more as a hobby versus a need.
That's a great question. I can't really speak to it in my work. I can tell you that I think of the work that's happening at the Green School in the Bahamas, and I would say that is a very community entrenched school. So and also is very action based, right? So I think it's not so much a hobby. I think the students, what they're trying to do as a school is like live what they're learning. So for example, they are doing work at the farm that's like right near like the school, right? So they have community members in the school. Like part of what they see, their function is also that climate communication. So they have people in the community in their school. They have a climate expo like every quarter where people come in and see the projects that they're working on. Each grade level has to have an environmentally oriented project. So that's sort of appropriate. So like the first and second graders might do something related to like, composting and getting more places to compost and use the farm. But like the fifth graders, when the last time that I visited the school, the fifth graders were trying to raise money and also build toilets that use recycled water, right? So there are different projects that I feel like the students are very like invested in. That's part of what they're doing. And they're also showing the community what they're doing. And I feel like it's much more like we have to do this, that it's not a hobby oriented space, which I think you do see that in some schools.
I'm thinking about Christine's work, and she talks a lot about this taking, and I think the word is Anthropocene, and right, that it's centered on people. And I think if you're looking at world citizenship, you're still looking at people. And she's saying you have to have it be, the earth centric.
Right.
And then that's where you're starting from.
Right.
And then exactly. And then the urgency is different, and the actors are differently positioned, and you're looking at.
That's like super interesting.
Yeah.
I wonder as well if it's urgent. I don't know people if it's a necessity in their lives, if they would necessarily identify as environmental aware, because if it's under survival,
Exactly.
completely different.
Exactly. Absolutely. And survival of the earth, right? And then all of it's connected.
One of the interesting things we've seen, not with this paper, but we do have another paper looking at the environmental optimism variable as well. And which I think relates to this a little bit, in that we are seeing that students they're more optimistic about climate problems that they're experiencing. And I don't know if that's because they see something terrible happening in their community and they see people acting, or they know they have more optimism. But so we're in a place like where so that they don't have air pollution, where they're like, oh gosh, air pollution is horrible. And they're not optimistic about there being a solution to the issue, which I think is actually interesting. But I think, I personally think we know very little about, one, there's the measure problems, but also what contributes to students actually seeing the environment the way that they do. So. Anyway, thank you for having me for all the good questions, and feel free to follow up anytime. And actually, I would love to, I don't know if I can get connected with your student. I would love to know more about what she's doing. That's super interesting. Yeah.
See you.
Thank you. Thanks.